I'm Chesney Ward Smith. I'm a clinical psychologist, and the proposed title for the PhD is An Exploration of Common Mental Disorders and Emotion Regulation Among South African Adolescents. So before we jump straight into things, I'd like to send out a few thank yous, especially to the Sue Struengmann Initiative. Thank you for making this work possible. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to the CPMH for all the support. It's really a wonderful team, especially Kat and Kay for your steadfast guidance getting to this point. Prof. Birking, looking forward to our collaborations, and our community partners, Students for Better Future and Community Keepers. I'm really looking forward to our work together. And then also to my reviewers, Profs. Mkhize and Mayers. Thank you for putting in the time. But just a roadmap for where we're going to be going, and we'll talk about the aims, the objectives and background, the methods per study phase, and some ethical considerations. So the main aim is to co-create and pilot an innovative evidence-based emotion regulation intervention with combined physical activity components for 15 to 18-year-old South African adolescents from under-resourced backgrounds who are at risk of common mental disorders. I know it sounds like a mouthful, but hopefully we'll get to a little bit of clarity in a bit. And also just to note that when we refer to common mental disorders, we're focusing on depression and anxiety specifically for this study. So there are 4 study objectives for the study. So the first is to determine the prevalence, risk, and protective factors associated with CMDs among 15 to 18-year-old South African adolescents from under-resourced backgrounds. The second one is to examine the psychometric properties of the emotion regulation skills questionnaire for use among older adolescents in our context. The third is to co-create an innovative evidence-based emotion regulation intervention with combined physical activity components for older adolescents in our context who are at risk of CMDs. And finally, to determine the acceptability and feasibility of this co-created intervention in our context. So as you can tell, objectives 1 and 2 are largely foundational work for the main aim. So jumping right into objective 1 is to determine the prevalence, risk, and protective factors associated with CMDs among older adolescents from under-resourced backgrounds. So just to give a little bit of background for this objective, the prevalence data for common mental disorders among South African adolescents is sparse, but estimates are thought to be high. Available studies that we do have are sometimes based off of adult data, or they focus on specific regions or settings, and some of them now are also quite dated. But some of the major concerns appear to be depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And the global estimates also reflect similar patterns, and they're varying ranges, but some of the data suggests the estimates range between 25 and 31%, depending on the cutoff scores used on the measures. Ultimately, the take-home message is that we need to have accurate CMD prevalence data for older adolescents to inform treatment in our context. And this study will address this prevalence gap for CMDs among older adolescents within a Western Cape school-based setting. We're moving on to the determinants of common mental disorders. So taking a social ecological systems approach, the literature shows that there are various risk and protective factors. So just briefly, some risk factors, they range from more individual factors such as age and gender to more social ones, so school-related stress, bullying, environmental factors, etc. And then protective factors also might include more personal things like psychological resilience and self-esteem, then more broadly to social support and positive family environments. But what is emerging from the literature is the strong role of adaptive emotion regulation as a protective factor for common mental disorders among adolescents. So the take-homes here are really that we need a realistic grasp of these determining factors in common mental disorders, and we need to explore the adaptive emotion regulation as an important factor in adolescent mental health. Which then leads into objective 2, which is to examine the psychometric properties of the emotion regulation skills questionnaire for older adolescents in South Africa. So a little bit of background for this objective. You might be wondering what emotion regulation is. It's our ability to monitor, evaluate, and change our emotional reactions and responses. And the literature indicates that the use of maladaptive emotion regulation techniques and emotion regulation difficulties plays a key role in the development and maintenance of common mental disorders among adolescents. However, few emotion regulation measures have been validated for use in our context for older adolescents. So the ERSQ is a 27-item self-report instrument, and it assesses one's adaptive emotion regulation skills, but it has yet to be adapted for our context for use among adolescents. So really we want to gauge where our adolescents are at in terms of emotion regulation, but we need to make sure that the measure is contextually appropriate for use among our adolescents. And as you'll see, emotion regulation is a key component of objectives 3 and 4. So we need to have a solid emotion regulation tool to work with. Oops. Okay, so jumping into objectives 3 and 4 is to recap. Objective 3 is to co-create an innovative evidence-based emotion regulation intervention with combined physical activity components for use among older adolescents in our context at risk of common mental disorders. And objective 4 is to determine the acceptability and feasibility of this intervention. For some background for these objectives, looking from an international perspective, available international transdiagnostic prevention interventions are available, and there are a few of them, and they range from kind of mindfulness-based stress reduction to emotion regulation training and affect regulation training, which I'm going to go into a little bit later. Then from a local point of view, there are a handful of psychosocial interventions, such as Aspire and Hashtag, for example, but really there are shortages of appropriate preventative psychological interventions for South African adolescents, and there are no prevention interventions focused specifically on emotion regulation in our context. So the idea is to address this gap directly by co-creating an emotion regulation intervention using an existing evidence-based intervention, which is affect regulation training. So using this as a starting point. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what affect regulation training is, it synthesizes various evidence-based elements of CBT and mindfulness and compassion-based treatments, emotion-focused therapy. As you can see there, it covers a number of different modalities. And it has shown promise for adults and adolescents across a range of mental health conditions, but mostly in high-income settings. And it remains unadapted and untested for adolescents in low and middle income settings such as ours. And this is important because foregrounding emotion regulation skills allows for a transdiagnostic approach to preventing and treating various mental disorders among adolescents. I just want to give you an idea of what affect regulation looks like for adolescents. So it has been adapted for adolescents in a group format with 1 session per week. And the intervention has about 5 different phases. So the first focuses on relaxation, so breathing techniques and muscle relaxation, then moves on to awareness, or that means, paying attention to our emotions and practicing non-judgment in relation to that. And then it focuses on acceptance of the current situation and self-support. So understanding that we need self-compassion and love when we're going through these type of things. And then the 5th phase is really about analyzing and modifying emotions, which focuses on cognitive reappraisal and problem solving. So up until this point, we've spoken a lot about emotion regulation, but I want to speak about the value of integrating physical activity components. So if you remember from a few slides ago, I spoke about local psychosocial interventions that are available here. Some of the feedback from those interventions indicates that we need more innovative physical activity components for intervention efficacy, but also for retention with adolescents. And the research also indicates this. So Physical activity components such as arts-based activities, physical exercise, including sport and hiking, can increase skill integration, enhance well-being in and of themselves, but also improve intervention retention, which is important when working with adolescents, as there can be high dropout rates. But as we've seen, there's a scarcity of emotion regulation interventions with combined physical activity components for older adolescents at risk of common mental disorders in our context. Okay, then going into the methods, just to give you an overview, it's a 3-phase mixed method study design. Phase 1 corresponds with objectives 1 and 2, phase 2 with objective 3, and phase 3 with objective 4. So phase 1 would be about determining the prevalence and determinants of common mental disorders among older adolescents, and then also examining the psychometric properties of the ERSQ. So setting and participants will work with the community keepers and Students for a Better Future, as Mirriam has already mentioned. We'll work with 6 schools from community keepers across 3 grades, so grades 10 to 12, and have 1 class per grade. And we'll also work with 50 SBF students for cognitive testing of the survey before formal testing, but I'm not going to discuss this here due to time limitations. The sample size calculation indicates that we need approximately 600 adolescents, and the inclusion criteria will be that they need to be aged between 15 and 18. They obviously need to consent, and will need parental consent. Okay, so then I wanted to just give an overview of the procedure for phase 1 in terms of consent processes. So we'll address all adolescents in each identified class to describe the study and consent process. We'll read and explain the information sheet and informed consent form to potential participants. We'll allow them to ask questions. And if they want to continue, then we'll ask them to explain in their own words what they understand before signing it. And then those who are interested will be given consent forms to take home to parents to sign and return. And after 2 weeks, parents whose children haven't returned the forms will be phoned by us to ask for verbal informed consent. And obviously only participants who return signed forms will be able to participate in the study, and if they meet inclusion criteria. They'll then be given a tablet-based survey in the language of their choice, which will take about 30 to 45 minutes to complete. And then 2 weeks after the main survey has taken place, it'll be re-administered to a randomly selected subsample of 150 participants across the grades to look at retest reliability of the ERSQ. Just wanted to give you a snapshot of the measures for the survey. So we'll look at depression and anxiety using the CESTI-10 and the GAD-7. These either have been or are currently being validated for use among South African adolescents. And then in terms of risk and protective factors, you can just have a read through. They align with the literature on risk and protective factors. But importantly, I want to note that we will use another measure to look at emotion regulation so that we can compare the ERSQ to the difficulties of emotion regulation scale, which is known as the DERS-16. And these measures have been chosen because they have been validated or found to be appropriate for use among adolescents in our context or similar context to ours. So data analysis for objective 1, use SPSS. We'll look at frequency distributions and descriptive stats for categorical and continuous variables as appropriate. Prevalence of depression and anxiety will be calculated using specific cutoffs. We'll look at the unadjusted and adjusted association between various risk and protective variables, and they will be analyzed in relation to depression and anxiety scores. And the results of the regression models will be reported as odds ratios with 95% confidence intervals. In data analysis for objective 2, we'll use Cronbach's alpha coefficients to look at the internal consistency of the SAE-RSQ. For the retest sample, we'll look at Pearson correlations of the ERSQ scores at baselines and a 2-week follow-up. And then to evaluate construct validity of the measure, we'll look at exploratory factor analysis to identify underlying dimensions of emotion regulation. Then for convergent validity, we'll look at Pearson correlations between the ERSQ and the DERS-16. Then for divergent validity, this will be determined by examining if the SAERSQ is able to differentiate between participants who screen positive for depression and anxiety and those who don't, using independent t-tests. Okay, so that is phase 1. In phase 2, this is where things get exciting. So it's about the co-creation of the emotion regulation intervention. We'll work with SPF students, approximately 60 of them, and the inclusion criteria will be the same as phase 1, with the added criterion of needing to screen at risk for depression and anxiety on those 2 measures. The informed consent and assent procedures will be the same as phase 1, and the research assistants will ideally be registered counselors who will also be involved with phase 3, as you'll see. Okay, so how are we going to co-create this intervention? We're going to use a human-centered design approach. And this is really about adopting the mindsets and practices of the population of interest, so highlighting and foregrounding their needs and experiences. And this process includes 4 iterative steps. So it's about discovering, so understanding participants and the context that they come from, designing, so co-ideating and designing the intervention, testing, assessing participants' acceptability of the adaptations that are made, and then refining speaks for itself. Okay, and then I want to give you a little bit of an idea of the procedure for phase 2, looking at the first iteration of the intervention with the first cohort. So this corresponds to the top bar in the diagram on the right. So we'll have 2 groups of 10 recruited for cohort 1, and participants will receive all 6 sessions of version 1. So version 1 will also be co-developed with the stakeholder advisory group. And during each session, the facilitators will deliver version 1 and present the accompanying materials. At the end of each session, participants will give feedback to the facilitators about important aspects that need supervision, things that worked, suggestions for improving the appeal, etc. And then at the end of the entire intervention, the process will be discussed via focus groups to assess intervention efficacy, gaps, convenience, benefits, risks, etc. And then based on these, version 2 of the intervention will be finalized and delivered to cohort 2. And the process will continue for 2 more cohorts. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a manualized emotion regulation intervention in preparation for phase 3. So I wanted to flag reflexivity and the importance of it at this phase, especially concerning researcher and facilitators' potential biases and positionalities, and how these will inevitably influence the research process. And I think this is also important considering the international roots of the affect regulation training, which is going to be used as the base, and ensuring that participants' voices and stories and opinions are heard and valued, and the intervention is actually co-created. Okay, and then data analysis for this phase. All of the feedback sessions will be recorded and transcribed and analyzed using in vivo and thematic analysis. And obviously the findings will be integrated into versions 2 of 3. All right. So that is phase 2. Moving on to phase 3, which is acceptability and feasibility of the co-created intervention. So this is a non-randomized pilot study utilizing quantitative assessments and qualitative focus groups and interviews. So we use the guidelines for reporting non-randomized pilot and feasibility studies, as well as the template for intervention description and replication guidelines. And then the consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative studies. This will be used just to enhance the reporting of the qualitative aspects of the research. In the settings for this phase, as in phase 1, we'll partner with community keepers and SPF. Approximately 6 schools will need about 150 participants, and they'll need to be aged between 15 and 18. They need to screen at risk for depression and anxiety. Suicidal participants will be excluded but immediately referred for further assessment with a community keepers or SPF counselor or psychologist. The informed consent procedures, they'll be identical to phase 2, but there'll be a strong emphasis on helping participants to understand what participation entails and commitment to the process. Then continuing procedure for phase 3, then they'll then get a tablet-based quantitative survey, and this will cover the same areas of mental health as per phase 1. And in terms of the actual intervention, we anticipate having 15 groups of about 10 participants each. The duration of the intervention will be about 6 weeks long, with 1 session per week at a school-based venue. Interventions will be run by the trained facilitators from phase 2, as I alluded to earlier, and supervised by me. There will then be follow-up assessments 1 week after the intervention has been completed, as well as 3 months after the intervention has been completed. And then here we'll have individual interviews with a subsample of 25 participants, as well as facilitators. Okay, so let's have a look at training and supervision for the facilitators. This is taking a task sharing approach. So as I mentioned, the facilitators will be 4 registered counsellors. They'll receive an additional 40 hours of training in terms of understanding common mental disorders, screening for depression and anxiety, basic counselling principles, and obviously the training in the actual intervention. And then during training, intervention-specific and core therapeutic competencies of the facilitators will be peer assessed using a pre-developed intervention-specific checklist, as well as the group ACT checklist. Then in terms of supervision, we'll have regular face-to-face and or virtual supervision and debriefing, which will be run by me. And this will really be about reviewing the logistics of the intervention, participants' progress, debriefing about challenges, and giving feedback about intervention delivery quality and how it can be improved. So for phase 3, the primary outcomes for this phase are about exploring the acceptability and feasibility outcomes. So in terms of feasibility outcomes, we'll have a look at the feasibility of recruitment, appropriateness of the data collection processes and outcome measures, retention, facilitator competencies, as I've mentioned, and any adverse events. In terms of acceptability outcomes, we'll do those semi-structured individual interviews with the participants, as well as facilitators, and then quantitatively we'll assess acceptability using the child evaluation inventory. Acceptability of the study procedures will be assessed using a pre-developed survey. And then in terms of clinical outcomes, the secondary outcomes include the clinical outcomes. So the measures, including the SEST-10 and the GAD-7 and all of the risk and protective factors measures, these measures may be used for future randomized control trials. Okay, then data analysis for this phase. For quantitative analysis, outcomes will be summarized descriptively using mean and standard deviation for continuous outcomes and numbers and proportions for categorical ones. Means and confidence intervals of the clinical outcomes will be calculated, and change in the clinical outcomes will be determined using dependent t-tests. Then for qualitative analysis, we'll use in vivo and thematic analysis as per phase 2. Then very quickly, I see you're going to go through some ethical considerations. One includes informed consent. So participants need to understand what the study entails. They need to understand that participation is voluntary, that there are not going to be any adverse consequences for not participating or dropping out, and we'll need consent from parents too. Just to flag some things in terms of confidentiality, we need private rooms for all the procedures. We need confidentiality agreements for the staff. We need security of the informed consent forms, and especially for personal data and data from the intervention, this will need to be de-identified and stored securely. And we'll obviously use firewall protected UCT server to store the data. In terms of risks, the study is deemed to be low risk to participants, and that it entails survey and intervention and interviews, but we have to plan for potential distress in terms of suicidal thoughts or self-harm, etc. And this is actually why we partnered with Community Keepers and Students for a Better Future, in that they have on-site psychological support available, so we can immediately refer if that is necessary. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Chesney. I think it's really amazing how the processes are quite linked together, and it does provide such a nice PhD. We do have 2 reviewers for you today. I also just wanted to remind everyone, so the nice thing about these PhD proposals is that you can modify and polish and bring up the scientific value of these proposals at this time. So this is kind of the point at this stage. So I'd like to first ask Professor Jason Mkhize, who I think is online. He's from the Institute for Life Course, Health Research at Stellenbosch University. Ah, there he is. Welcome, Jason. Thank you. Thanks for making the time.
Hi, Kat. Thanks for inviting me and including me.
Great. Over to you. Over to you for your comments for Chesney.
Hi, Chesney. Lovely to see you again. And this is a really impressive piece of work. I felt like I was reading a dissertation when I kind of picked it up and experienced the length of it and the density of it. So well done. It's a really impressive study. It's been well conceptualized. I think it's got the scope and depth for a PhD. So everything I say from here on in is premised on the fact that this is an excellent study, and you're in good hands with your supervisors and all of that. So I'm just going to say some things here that are kind of thought-provoking as a way of pushing the envelope a little bit to encourage you to think about some of the things that you've said and proposed. One of the issues that I had early up in the thesis was that on page 4 in the aims, you talk about the aim, and this seems to be the aim for phase 1, is to determine, that you're selecting adolescents from under-resourced backgrounds. And I think that phrase under-resourced backgrounds is like kind of catch-all phrase that has some intuitive understanding of it, but I don't think it's actually clearly operationalized. And what I mean by low resource or under-resourced environment might not be what you mean by an under-resourced environment. So I want to push you a little bit perhaps to be quite explicit about what that term means. I think it's used as a catch-all, like even people talk about South Africa, talk about the South African context, as if there's one South African context. There's not one South African context. People live in a variety of South African contexts. So maybe tighten up that under-resourced backgrounds and clarify what you mean by that. The aim for phase 1, you talk about determining or establishing the determinants of common mental disorders. And then you talk about identifying risk and protective factors. Those words, determinants, risk, and protective factors, imply some kind of causality. But yet the research method that you're proposing is a cross-sectional survey, which at best is going to tell you about associations or correlations between variables. There's no way from the research design that you've got that you'll be able to say that this caused this, that this was the determinant of the common mental disorder. Let me take an example. You're going to assess depression and anxiety, and then you're going to assess substance use. And you might conclude then that substance use is a risk factor for depression. But actually, we have no way of knowing from your study whether the depression came first or the substance use came first. So I think it's misleading, or it's sloppy to use the words determinants and risk and protective factors. At best, your study can tell us associations between variables. To tidy up that. While we're talking about the measures in the first phase, you talk about common mental disorders, but then you clearly focus on only depression and anxiety. And I don't know why you weren't upfront about that in the title, to say that this is an intervention for depression and anxiety, that you're investigating depression and anxiety. There are other common mental disorders like attention difficulties that you're not looking at here. So I think it's an overreach, or that the term common mental disorders may be too broad. Having said that, I noticed that in your instruments, you're including measures of substance use and PTSD, for example. Why are those not common mental disorders? Why is the PTSD not a common mental disorder? Why are you considering it in the second group of factors, what you've called risk or protective factors? Likewise with substance use, I think substance use disorder is a mental disorder. So if you're going to use common mental disorders, maybe you want to move PTSD and substance use into those outcomes, or make it a transdiagnostic intervention for depression and anxiety. The instrument seems very long, 30 to 45 minutes for adolescents. We struggle to get university students to complete surveys that are longer than 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm just flagging that, and I'm sure you've thought carefully about that. But the link between phase 1 and phase 2 and 3 and 4 is a little less clear to me why it's necessary to measure all of these risk factors if they're not directly related to the design or implementation of the study. I completely see the rigor around the need to tighten up the measure of emotional regulation, but some of the other measures, it's not clear to me why they've been included and how they feed into your design of that. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that the intervention is co-created. You've already decided what the intervention is, and I know that participant involvement and service user involvement and all of this is politically, very politically correct at the moment, and it's absolutely the right thing to do. But many cases where where service user involvement is claimed, it's lip service to that. So I want to push you to say, if you're going to say it's co-created, how much co-creation? You've already determined what the intervention is going to be, and it seems like the input you're going to get from the adolescents is really about the delivery of the intervention, and maybe some of the activities. Can that really be said to be co-created if they're only advising on the implementation, or have I missed something? Is their input going to be greater than that? On one of your slides, you said, and you were talking about phase 2 in the co-creation phase, and you said focus groups, and then you said focus groups to establish the efficacy of the intervention. I didn't pick it up in the proposal, but I saw it in one of your slides now. As you said elsewhere, your aim here is not about efficacy, and no focus group is going to tell you about the efficacy of these kinds of interventions. My comments, Chesney, as I say, probably appear quite critical, but my overriding impression of this is a really good study, and I'm nitpicking here with the things that I've highlighted, really just as a way of spurring you to think perhaps a little bit more carefully about some of the things. Thanks, Kat. That's all I've got for now.
Thanks so much, Chesney. I think that's really helpful. And I was actually, as Chesney was presenting, I was also thinking maybe looking at emotional regulation and how it's a mediating factor. If we're thinking, look, we don't want to scare Chesney with structural equation modeling, so we don't want to do that now. But so I think that's a really interesting point. And maybe this time at the end we can come back to that, depending on what the other reviewer raises. But I think that is an interesting thing to look at mediators and the mechanisms of change. But let's leave that for now. Great, that's very helpful. Chesney, did you want to respond to anything at this stage, or do you want to reflect on it, given we're a bit short of time?
I think, yeah, thanks, Jason. I mean, you've given me some good things to think about. Yeah, I think the point about co-creation and of the intervention and what that actually will mean on the ground, I think for me that's very important to think about going forward. Yeah, but there's a lot. Thank you so much for your comments.
Yeah.
Good luck. It's exciting stuff.
Thanks so much, Jason. To Bronwyn. I'm sorry, Bronwyn Myers, I should probably introduce as well. I assume that everyone knows Bronwyn because we see her so often. She was at the South African Medical Research Council until very recently, and now she has moved to Australia, sadly, but we're so happy to have her on the call today. So welcome, Bronwyn.
Thank you so much, and Chesney, congratulations on an excellent proposal. And my comments are build off Jason's, and I said along in the same vein that it's a great proposal. There's definitely the scope is definitely sufficient for a PhD. For a PhD, you really want 4 good papers, and you certainly can get at least 4 good papers. But so my suggestions are, how can we move it from good to great, and so to improve the rigor and the science. But also for a PhD, you have to think about balance breadth versus depth. And an important consideration that reviewers and examiners will look at is what is the contribution to the field. So my one general comment is that in your actual protocol would be to foreground and be very explicit about what you're going to be producing through your PhD, apart from a service and a clinical significance, is what knowledge are you going to be producing that will contribute to the field. So a section on that, I think, would really strengthen your protocol. But I'm going to make other comments also about the science, and maybe I'll be a little bit controversial or challenging, and my comments are really set in the veins of how can we strengthen what is already good. So I'm going to go straight into it. I agree with everything that Jason suggested, and especially around the language, but using the language like determine and determinants. It's kind of dangerous territory, and to try and avoid that kind of language in what is essentially quite an exploratory and formative developmental study. And that is absolutely fine. You just have to be clear and stay within the scope of your aims. My comments about aim 1 are that I think it's a bit of a leap to be able to establish both the prevalence of common mental disorders and in quite a contained study. And I wonder whether that should really be the primary objective of aim 1, given that your whole thesis and the story of your thesis is really focused on emotional regulation. So looking at all of the background around common mental disorders and the mental health care system, while relevant and framing, I think you can be a lot more targeted and look at how do we understand emotional regulation? Why is it an important target for psychosocial interventions for young people? And think about how, through aim 1, how can you better understand factors that may be associated with emotional regulation and how and mediators and moderators. So how does trauma and substance use intersect and interplay with emotional regulation to perhaps influence risk of depression and anxiety? And I've got some comments in your actual protocol, and I'll send those comments through to you so that I'm a little bit clearer. So I think you can rejig aim 1 to look at, have a different focus. And so instead of it being more of the same and looking at potential risk and factors associated with depression and anxiety amongst young people, you can look at factors associated with emotional regulation. And you can still measure depression and anxiety and the relationship between emotional regulation and depression and anxiety. But you've really decided that your intervention is going to be focused on emotional regulation. So you will want to understand what other things may need to be considered in that intervention. The other thing that concerned me that I thought perhaps you underplayed or did not go into enough depth about was the role of physical activity. It felt like it was a little bit of an add-on and wasn't completely integrated into your conceptualization in the literature. And I can understand, I can fully understand why physical activity components would potentially help, potentially have an additive effect for an intervention that is focused on affect regulation, because there's a neurological basis for how physical activity can help modulate emotions, and there's there's many theories about the role of physical activity in stress reduction and so forth. But you gloss over that, and I think you can maybe foreground that a little bit more, and then and cut back some of the contextual information that you provide. So I think you need to provide a greater rationale for your reasoning behind the physical activity component. For the methods, for your data, both the sample size calculations as well as your survey design for aim 1 and your data analysis, I think you might benefit, if you have not already, benefit from speaking to a statistician who has some expertise in survey design. Because of the way that you propose selecting the schools and the classrooms, there's going to be clustering. And the clustering needs to be taken into account, both with your sample size calculations as well as within your analyses. So that's just something to think about. And you could potentially think about randomly selecting the schools, and also and perhaps stratifying them based on their location in the sample. Similarly, talking about clustering, similarly, because you've got a group-based intervention, and I know you're just doing descriptive, your analyses are purely descriptive for phase 3. You might, however, still need to think about clustering of effects within the group. And I think in the previous presentation, Prof. Matthews was also referring to sort of a group process that happens, and which might, if a group is well facilitated or people bond in a group, their outcomes might be better. And this is why thinking about clustering, or at least exploring whether there's clustering, will be an important thing to consider in your analysis for phase 3. I'm jumping around a little bit. Also, just to go back to your measures, both in phase 1 and in phase 3, I do agree with Jason that you need to keep it light. But if emotional regulation is your key outcome, and that's what you hope your intervention is going to impact on, and this is a question for you, have you thought about other underlying challenges that adolescents may experience that could impact on emotional regulation, apart from the usual factors that we know, such as substance use and adverse childhood experiences? I'm thinking about children who are neurodiverse, who have ASD, or who have cognitive deficits of some sort, learning disabilities, ADHD. We know that they struggle with emotional regulation. And so the kids that you might be recruiting and seeing in some of the classrooms may quite well be struggling with some of those issues which may be undiagnosed. I don't have a solution for this, but I think it's just something at least to think about, and even if it's thought through as a limitation, but it seems that I don't think it can be glossed over, particularly in our context where detection of these kinds of issues is sometimes poor. I think I will leave it at that. It's really, I think that the potential for contribution to knowledge is great, and I think with a little bit of tweaking, this will. I'm looking forward to seeing the outcome. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. You've given me a lot to think about. Great comments. Yeah, thank you so much. Really, it helps a lot. I mean, everything's jumbled up in my mind right now, but yeah, some really useful comments, especially in relation to, I'm thinking about the clustering and speaking to a statistician, like that's Kat, we need to talk about that. Yeah, and especially your last comment about the measures, and how do we factor in other issues like learning disorders and attention difficulties, and yeah, that's something I hadn't actually thought about at all, so thanks for that.
And I kind of like with Jason and Bronwyn's comment about potentially changing AIM-1 to not just be prevalence and risk factors, but to kind of maybe look at a model that'll give you much more information with all the other neurocognitive things, but we can also think about maybe just modifying it to make the science higher, which I think is great. But we won't share it. We have to do some kind of structural equation modeling. But I think it's possible, which is great. Wonderful. It is a bit after 2. Apologies. So thank you everyone, especially the reviewers, and to Chesney and Mirriam for your wonderful presentations. If anyone has any questions or would like to give comments, please do email us and we will get back to you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we'll be unable to put to the floor for questions. So thanks everyone, and congrats again. We'll see you next time.